Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining in today. I'm going to be talking about some of the things to expect post-deadline of GDPR coming into force on the 25th of May. So things we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be reviewing some of the GDPR principles, particularly around transparency and accountability. Accountability being the new principle that's been introduced from the previous Data Protection Act, 1998. We're going to be looking at some new rights and risks, the fines, data protection officers, and technology. Some of the principles around transparency and accountability. Accountability is the new seventh principle that covers the six primary principles, if you like, within GDPR. But looking at transparency for the moment, transparency states that personal data shall be processed lawfully, fairly and in a transparent manner in relation to the data subject, whether that be your customers, your suppliers and your employees. And the principle of transparency requires that any information addressed to the public or to the data subject should be concise, easily accessible, easy to understand, using clear and plain language, so it shouldn't be hidden behind legalese, and additionally where appropriate visualization should be used, especially when dealing with children. Such information could be provided in an electronic form, for example, when addressed to the public through a website, and it's of particular relevance in situations where the proliferation of actors and the technological complexity of practice make it difficult for data subjects to know and understand whether and by whom and for what purpose personal data relating to him or her are being collected, such as in the case of online advertising. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, children require special consideration, and the regulation states that children merit specific protection, and any information and communication where processing is addressed to a child should be in a clear and plain language that a child can easily understand. Going on from that, modalities should be provided for facilitating the exercise of data subject rights under this regulation, including mechanisms to request and, if applicable, obtain free of charge, in particular access to and rectification or erasure of personal data and the exercise of the right to object. Around that, most people will be enacting those rights with regard to the right of access via something called a subject access request, which you may be aware of. And post the 25th of May, a number of my customers have seen an increase in the number of subject access requests that they've received. The controller, so if you are the individual that determines how the data is being processed, that would make you the controller. You should provide a means for requests to be made electronically, especially where personal data is collected by electronic means, or certainly on website sign-up forms. And the controller should be obliged to respond to requests from the data subject without undue delay, and at the latest within 1 month, and to give reasons where the controller doesn't intend to comply with any such requests. So subject access requests were in the previous Data Protection Act, but previously companies could charge up to £10 and you had 40 days to respond. That's now been changed so that no charge can be levied in the majority of cases, and the timeline has been reduced now to 30 days. Talking around sort of accountability and the other six principles within GDPR, so data controllers are responsible for being able to demonstrate compliance with the six principles, and you're going to require documented policies and procedures in order to be able to demonstrate accountability. And the six principles under GDPR, they were there under the Data Protection Act 1998, but they are that personal data shall be processed lawfully, fairly and transparently, collected for its specified, explicit and legitimate purposes, adequate, relevant and limited to what is necessary, so you shouldn't be holding any more data than you strictly need. It needs to be accurate and kept up to date, kept only for as long as necessary, and processed in a manner that ensures its security. And then across all of those, as I mentioned, is this sort of seventh principle, one of accountability. So that's the new thing over and above the Data Protection Act 1998, is this requirement that data controllers need to be able to demonstrate accountability. So what are the practical implications there? Well, one, you need to know the data that you hold and process. It's critical for you to identify the lawful basis for each processing activity. And how would you go about doing that? Well, you create a data map. For each processing activity, carefully consider the lawful basis upon which you rely. Historically, a number of people have assumed that consent or implied consent would be appropriate, but you shouldn't rely on consent where it can't be withdrawn, such as an employment contract. If you would still process data even after consent has been withdrawn, then consent wouldn't be a lawful basis. But you would have legitimate interests in processing certain elements of your data, but it's not a get-out-of-jail card. So you need to balance your legitimate interests against those of the data subject, taking their right, along with their rights and freedoms, and taking their expectations into account. And as I just mentioned, implied consent, it's not acceptable under GDPR. If you rely on implied consent at the moment, you should start making changes now in order to become accountable with regard to the regulation. So the tasks to do, you should map your data processing for each processing activity, identify the lawful basis. If you rely on consent at the moment, ensure that you have evidence that valid consent was given. Also that the quality of the consent given meets the requirements. For example, have you informed your subjects of their rights, including their right to withdraw consent? Consider where you process children's data or the special categories of personal data. There are specific obligations relating to these types of data regarding the lawfulness of processing. Ensure that your privacy notice state the lawful basis for the processing activity, and ensure your records state the legal ground upon which you rely for processing. So the rights that we have now as data subjects, as individuals, for when people are processing our data, are as follows. We have a right to information, and so the way that that is managed is via privacy notices in the main, and those privacy notices need to require your controller details, so that'll be the organisation details, contact details with regard to the data protection officer, if you have one, and you may well be legally required to have one, the purpose of the processing, your legal basis, if you're using legitimate interest as a legal basis, what are those legitimate interests, the recipients of the information, if you're transferring the data to third countries, so that those are countries outside of the European Economic Area in the main, the retention periods for the data, data subject rights, the existence of automated decision-making and profiling. And then we have the right to access, and that's typically being enacted by a subject access request. And a data subject can request information relating to the purpose of their processing, the categories of their personal data, the recipients, the retention period, their rights, and the source of the personal data. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, the right to charge £10 has now been removed, and the timeline reduced from 40 days to 30 days. We have a right to object to processing, so we as data subjects can object to processing for direct marketing, profiling, automated decision making, and for scientific or historical purposes, so that has particular relevance for marketing efforts. And unless you can show legitimate interest overriding the interests, rights and freedoms of the data subject, all processing carried out for reasons of the public interest. We have a right to rectification, so we've got a right to rectify inaccurate and incomplete data. We have a right to erasure, to be forgotten, where data is no longer necessary for the purpose and other grounds. That's an important element to that. So the right to erasure isn't an absolute right. If you have, as employers, you will have other legal obligations to retain certain data, let's say with regard to in the field of employment, you will have requirements to retain information for HMRC reporting. So the right to be forgotten isn't an absolute right. But there is also a right to restrict processing. So if if a data subject was contesting the accuracy or felt that the processing was unlawful, or you as the controller of that data no longer required it, we have a right to restrict the processing. And we have the right to data portability, so moving our personal data from one data controller to another controller in a machine-readable format. Some examples around data portability would be if you've moved your gas supplier or other utility supplier, if you're with, let's say, an EDF and decide to move to npower, then EDF have to transfer certain data across to npower. You'd also find the same with regard to mobile phone contracts if you wanted to move, let's say, from Vodafone to O2. So in practice, a lot of this has been going on at an industry level for several years now, but we do now have that right. That's now been the law has in effect caught up. So some practical implications around this. Privacy notices, sometimes called fair processing notices, are very important. You may need multiple privacy notices for the various ways in which you collect personal data based on the different legal grounds on which you rely. Subject access requests need careful consideration. You might get very few, if any, up to this point, but I expect this number to increase due to publicity and the removal of the £10 charge. And ensure that you have accountable and responsible persons appointed and have a documented procedure in place. Educate your employees to make sure that they can recognise a subject access request when it comes in. Give consideration to how you will identify all the personal data you hold in response to a subject access request and how you will redact other personal data. So you shouldn't release third-party information with regard to a subject access request. And also give consideration to how you will restrict or prevent processing after an objection or request to restrict. How would you facilitate data portability and erasure should that be requested by one of your data subjects? So, the things to do. Review your privacy notices and update them to meet the required standards. Identify different notices that you may need to give in different situations. You'll need different ones, one for your employees and one for your customers, for example. Identify roles and responsibilities for dealing with data subject rights. Create formal procedures and ensure that all employees are aware of the steps to take. Consider creating formal templates for responding to subject access requests and other rights requests. Review your internal processes and resources involved in facilitating subject access requests and the exercise of rights, and ensure your data map and processing records identify the locations where your personal data is processed and stored, because that will facilitate subject access responses. So now I want to talk about the fines and the levies. GDPR is not about fines. It's about putting the consumer and the citizen first. The ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office in the United Kingdom, has the power now to impose fines much bigger than the £500,000 allowed under the Data Protection Act 1998. There are a number of companies that are fearful of the maximum £17 million sterling, or 4% of global turnover allowed under the new law. But GDPR is not about crippling financial punishment. Scaremongering suggests that the ICO will make early examples of organisations for minor infringements aren't true. The ICO themselves are committed to guiding, advising and educating organisations how to comply with the law. They've always preferred the carrot to the stick. So the ICO record, as of August 2017, they made these points. The issuing fines has and will continue to be a last resort. The financial year 2016-2017, they concluded 17,300 cases, 16 of which resulted in fines. They're yet to invoke their maximum powers. And prediction of massive fines under the GDPR that simply scale up penalties that have been issued under the Data Protection Act, they've stated are nonsense. The UK ICO did fight for increased powers when the GDPR was being drawn up, and heavy fines for serious breaches are there to reflect the importance of personal data in a 21st century world. But they do intend to use these powers proportionately and judiciously. Fines may be the sledgehammer in their toolbox, but they now have access to lots of other tools that may be just as effective. Like the GDPR, like the Data Protection Act, the GDPR gives a suite of sanctions to help organisations to comply, such as warnings, reprimands, and corrective orders. And whilst they won't hit organisations in their pocket directly, reputations may suffer a significant blow. And that's one of the things that I would always be wary of if for an organisation suffering a data breach. It's not necessarily the financial impact, but certainly the reputational harm that could be done to an organisation. I mentioned data protection officers as part of privacy notice. If you that you would have to put their contact details in should you appoint a data protection officer. And a data protection officer is legally required to be appointed in one of the following 3 scenarios. So if the processing is carried out by a public authority or body, except for courts, if the core activities of the controller or the processor consist of processing operations which by virtue of their nature, their scope and purpose require regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale, or finally, the core activities of the controller or processor consist of processing large-scale of special category data relating to health, ethnicity, beliefs and sexual preferences. Those are what's termed the special category data, or relating to criminal convictions. So if it's special category data or data relating to criminal convictions on a large scale, then again you're going to be legally required to appoint a data protection officer. Now, large scale hasn't been defined within GDPR, and as such, organisations are required to use their own judgment. Our position would be to take the view would be what would make a headline in the tabloid press. So if you're looking at if the data that you're dealing with is predominantly in the B2B market, and you've got 500 suffer a data breach of 500 data subjects, then that probably wouldn't be considered large scale. If you have 10,000 B2B contacts, I'd say it probably would. However, when dealing with special category data, if you saw a headline across the tabloid press of 500 individuals' health records, then that probably would make headline news, so I would probably turn that as large. So you are required to use your own judgment, and as I say, the best feel for that I have is what would make it as far as the tabloid press is concerned. The Data Protection Officer themselves, it's a vitally important strategic position for ensuring ongoing regulatory compliance, and it's clearly defined within GDPR. The position does require expert knowledge of data protection and outsourcing. It's therefore viewed as a practical and affordable alternative to recruitment. Many organisations are challenged by the extent of knowledge necessary for an effective data protection officer, including the legal ramifications that are likely to emanate from increased data subject rights, as well as potential breaches. There's also can be a conflict of interest that organisations need to consider when appointing within, as individuals who access data subject information in an operational capacity can't be enrolled. So this conflict of interest is negated by appointing an external data protection officer. And ongoing regulatory compliance is demanding on any organisation, particularly when it's so important to remain focused on your core activities, getting on with the business as usual. So CyberCrowd, we've designed a service that provides all of the necessary support and guidance in a way that enables customers to remain aligned to business as usual and your continuing growth and prosperity. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alexander Lewis, and he can talk around the technology aspect with regard to GDPR. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yep, as Mark correctly said, I'm here to talk around technology and how that can assist within GDPR. So let me start by saying that the stance Softcat are taking within this is that GDPR is a risk reduction legislation. It is not a technology compliance framework or a technology shopping list. It's important to understand that what GDPR is encouraging you to do is not go out and buy technologies and implement them. It's about to look at your risk appetite within the business, look at what is a reasonable and affordable risk to administer to, and then to look at technology infrastructure that helps remediate that risk. The key point to take away on that one is to make sure that the way that you articulate how you've come to the decisions of which of your security technology fabrics that you've procured, how you articulate that is key. So although we don't expect everyone to go out and buy the best of everything and, you know, the stuff to mitigate small kind of probability attacks, if we can articulate why we've come to that decision intelligently, that demonstrates the mature security attitude that the GDPR is trying to encourage. Within that, obviously, reporting and evidencing falls into that. So it's not the systems we have, but it's also how we can prove we're using them. So running reports, running tests, penetration testing, things like that. We can evidence that we are doing what in our policy and in our infrastructure we've set out to achieve, then we can demonstrate there that we're actually following it and not just being compliant in something or addressing something once and leaving it there without proper administration. As part of that risk reduction legislation, I'm going to go through a few different areas of technology that maximize the amount of risk it can mitigate fairly quickly. I've defined these as quick wins, not because they're easy to install or easy to source, but they maximize a lot of risk to be reduced in quite a low effort in terms of the number of systems they touch and the processing that they come in. The last bit around this is to discuss what are likely attack vectors for your business internally. So if you are a type of business that probably uses, you know, email is their main point of contact, it is likely that phishing is going to be one of your likely attack vectors, and we need to discuss as a business how we're going to manage that risk accordingly. If it's someone that, you know, doesn't use email so much, but we have a lot of people on site who use removable media, it could be that there is malicious removable media that could be more likely as an attack vector for you. So it's important to understand what the relevant risk and attack vectors are for you internally as a business, because they will be unique to you. So one of the first quick wins I'm going to discuss is vulnerability scanning. So vulnerability scanning is a tool that assesses the IT estate for any known software weaknesses. So it looks through your software estate, checks against the current firmware versions, and identifies any that haven't been patched appropriately or if there's any known vulnerabilities about those systems. For those of you that don't know, where you have vulnerability scanning in place and you're mitigating that, there's a lot of different facts and figures out there about it, but to give you an idea, almost 50% of recorded attacks leverage known or old vulnerabilities. There's been examples of this previously in WannaCry, for example, where we saw that attack. The patch for that, or the MS 017010 patch, was available in March, but it's because systems hadn't been patched and they were unaware of the vulnerabilities that the malware was able to propagate so quickly. One of the frameworks we use internally here, which is the Center for Internet Security and SANS Critical Security Controls Infrastructure, the first 5 controls are able to mitigate the most common attacks, and up to 85% of them. And using vulnerability scanning can help address 4 out of 5 of them. This is one of the reasons it's a quick win, because it does maximize the amount that we can put in place in terms of the risk mitigation involved in that. Regular scanning is one to touch on this, so it's not just a case of scanning willy-nilly. We need a process involved where we scan once a week, twice a week, whichever the risk appetite and your resource allows you to achieve. And we also need to make sure that we're patching appropriately on the back end of that, so we have a strategy for scanning and understanding our vulnerabilities and remediating them. It brings quite nicely onto my next point, which is patch management. So this goes hand in hand with vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning is making us aware of our vulnerabilities. Patch management is going out and actually addressing those and putting in place the patches to remove the vulnerability. There's loads of reasons why you should be doing this, and it should hopefully to any IT security administrators and IT managers not be anything new. It's not one of these things that's particularly attractive or, you know, interesting in the security world, but it is your housekeeping to make sure that the systems are patches and updates on their latest version. Over 80% of breaches are a result of poor patch management, and that is basically one of the key things. If you think actually we can cut out 80% of our breaches just by having a patch management strategy, and that's going to be, you know, one of the quickest wins that you're going to get out of this. So, I mean, the ease of this is mind-boggling. I mean, we see quite a lot in networking security specialism that people come across and say things like we're using WSUS or we don't want to use an extra tool. WSUS is a great tool for a Microsoft estate, but when you're looking to patch third-party applications, things like Adobe, things like the CRMs that you're using, these aren't included within that. If you are still managing through SCCM, however, there are different solutions that are able to integrate to SCCM as a console and still patch those so those third-party systems within that as well. So if you're using SCCM and you would like to kind of group patch management into part of that, that is still achievable. It really does come down to this process of having a hand-in-hand relationship where we scan once or twice a week and we patch systems based on the severity of the vulnerability and the operational impact that that system will have. Obviously, patching a CRM in the middle of trading hours is not going to be a viable solution, but ensuring that if we have a particularly high-risk vulnerability come through on the vulnerability scanning, that there is a strategy to make sure that that is patched as a priority as soon as the doors close at 5 or 6 o'clock, whenever the business closed. So one of the other quick wins, and again, this is going to be something that you've probably seen quite a lot of, it is going to be end-user education. This is making sure that the end users, which are kind of the hardest risk to quantify, are trained and aware of cybersecurity. Previously, especially in office environments, there's this atmosphere of we trust everyone, and we kind of, if we find a USB stick on the floor, we'll plug it in, see who it is, and find out who it is because we want to be helpful. Part of what we're trying to do here is encourage more of an understanding of actually, I've seen a USB, is it a security risk? Has it got malware on it? Which is quite a hard culture change to put into any business. And the NCSC 10 Steps to Cybersecurity, this is step 5 of it. And there is a mixture of technology and policy that are involved here. So it's not just, sit down with your end users and tell them that they need to check the address in the email to make sure it's not a phishing email. That is really important as well, but that still doesn't negate having a really good email security solution that's going to assist and block the lion's share of malicious emails coming through. On the policy side, there's a lot you can do there around ensuring you've had that training, but equally investing in tools that are going to allow you to regularly run benign phishing attempts yourselves through various tools to assess actually which users are clicking on links, which users are flagging it to IT security, and making sure actually that back-end process is working as well. So when we flag something, or an end user said, I think this is a suspicious email, is it going to IT security? Is it going to the right person? If it's an email about HR, are they sending it to HR instead of IT security, for example? I mean, the stats there kind of really speak for themselves. Around 76% of organizations reported being a victim of a phishing attack. It's obviously one of the main attack vectors that we see out there, and 24% of breaches caused by employee error. And this is one of the more smaller statistics I could find on kind of employee error. There's, varying market depending on the geographical area that they've surveyed, but accidental users being one of the highest that we see out of there. So you will get the malicious insider who has, for example, been asked to leave the business and is trying to take as much data as he can away, or trying to leak something that's internal company confidential. But more than likely, it's going to the accidental users, and those are the ones that we want to maximise the education of as part of that quick win. This is the last quick win that I'm going to talk about here, which is breach simulation. Breach simulation allows you to test your infrastructure against multiple attack vectors. So this is about having an agent that will assess your infrastructure and physically run a breach on it to see how the infrastructure stands up and see whether or not it would be something that would be successful, whether there are enough systems in place that would mitigate against that. Equally, it can test your instant response procedures. So one of the things about GDPR is that you have 72 calendar hours to respond to a breach, and one of the common things we'll find is people will have a response procedure that's perhaps written that says that these are the people that are staying, or these are the people that are staying during the week time. But if it falls onto a Saturday, onto a Friday evening, who is going to be staying late, and how is that going to be managed, and how many people need to stay late? That's one of the other areas, for example, in instant response procedures, that if you don't run these through a test, that you may work out actually it's not properly written, and then everyone decides to go off and do their own thing, and the process becomes a lot more complex. You're able to test different scenarios, so it's not just the same vector over and over again. So you can test against web, you can test against email, you can test against USB, for example. There's lots of different threat scenarios you can test for, and I said actually how you are strong at defending against one or defending against another, and it can identify either configuration gaps or kind of your security fabric gaps within that as well. Lastly, you're able to audit your security regime, so as part of a demonstration of security maturity that would be kind of evidence to the ICO, you'd be able to say, actually, we have run a threat simulation once a month, once 6 months, once every year, against these vectors to prove actually we are still correct. We've not left a configuration and let it go stale for years, and now it's not relevant because the business has moved on. We're able to do that, and if we have all this practice in place, we're able to essentially have a mitigation strategy in place for these attacks preemptively, so that actually when we're ready and raring for these attacks to come in, that we're able to deal with them rapidly. And we've also tested to make sure that our infrastructure is prepared as well. So this is not itself in a quick win, but from my perspective, this is something I view as the beating heart of ensuring where data goes. The D in GDPR is for data, and obviously DLP is one of the main tools that we see in controlling the way and how data moves across the network. The diagram above is a good diagram to basically demonstrate what DLP is. It's essentially understanding what data, who is using it, where it's going, how it's going there, and then putting actions into a stop or allow or to encrypt or to basically ensure that there is policy to control that particular type of data. DLP is the beating heart of any data strategy, and there are tools in place that allow us to make sure that we can enable businesses to use their data appropriately, but within that still ensure that company data is left secure. There is often this misunderstanding that around DLP you have to trade off security for collaboration, but with a DLP that's intelligent, you're able to do both. So we can say on any one of these classifiers who's using the data or where it's going or what data it is, or a combination of all of them, we can have a different action in place. So it may be that we want to flag an information to the user to say, actually, are you sure you want to send this way? This is against company policy. And if they click yes, still not send it, but notify that they need some training, or we can enforce encryption and things like that. So having a DLP strategy in place will allow you to have a beating heart around your data migration. It is not the only technology investment that needs to be done as part of GDPR, but I think it's one of the highest risk mitigations because of the breadth it can hold across the entire data. It's also Control 13 of the CIS-SANS critical security controls, and it allows you to have again, address a lot of risk within that as well. This can also be quite automated for businesses who say, I don't have a dedicated SOC or I don't have a team who are able to manage this data lock prevention strategy. You are able to automate in the back end with most of this remediation action, say if the data contains a 16-digit credit card number, then we want to classify it as this, and these are the actions that classification makes. And this can all be automated and just flagged when there's an incident that is particularly suspicious to have a look at. It will enable you to equally identify suspicious internal activity. This is from a data-centric perspective. So this isn't looking at the user. It doesn't look at how many times the user logged in and out, or how many systems they've accessed. It doesn't baseline their behavior. It simply looks at data. If you are particularly concerned about users, that's another investment of an insider threat technology to baseline user behavior and do that. That is, again, something you need to assess against your own risk appetite as to whether that's an appropriate investment. It's still a good piece of technology to have, but only if the cost mitigates a reasonable amount of risk as part of your risk reduction strategy. Lastly, the last piece I wanted to touch on here is Softcat Cyber Assessment Services. So there'll be a lot of businesses that perhaps have listened to what I've had to say and have gone, actually, with some of those quick wins we're doing some of them, or we don't know how well we're doing them, or actually we need to go and do them. Part of what Softcat offers is Cyber Assessment Services. So within that, we're able to bring a security consultant on site who is going to assess your infrastructure and your security technologies and policies against industry standards. So we will look at all the different bits and pieces you're doing in security, not just the technology you have, but actually how you're engaging with that, and assess that against an industry framework. Within that, you will then understand actually not only what risks you have within that, but how you can prioritize and address those risks, and this will be equally quick wins, and also from that side, the longer term projects that we need to kind of look through within that. The kind of next, second, and third step within that is our cyber intelligence services. This is a service that Softcat are building out within security incident and event management, or SIEM service. This is essentially working as having an overlay log aggregation system where we're able to do analytics on your behalf and make you aware early doors of any suspicious activity on your network, any vulnerabilities, and give you remediation guidance in the form of regular contact through a dedicated personnel within that. Lastly, Our cyber operations services are essentially our managed firewall service that we offer. So essentially we offer a service where through looking at your firewall and kind of watching the traffic as it flows through there, we can manage and understand and kind of notify you within the security of that device, and equally through trouble fixing within the support environment as well. And that allows you to outsource a lot of that risk and understanding to Softcat, who have a wealth of resource within our firewalling engineering team. We have 24/7 network operations centres, 2 across the UK, and we have world-class engineering resource within that as well. So within those 3 different services, we can assist the customer going through their security journey, both from the beginning and understanding where you are as a business, and helping you through discovery, whether that's through Softcat services or third-party services or policy writing or technology, to getting you to the point where, from a risk reduction strategy, you desire to be. I think the key points to take away there are to understand where you're vulnerable, the risks you have that are most likely. So not just the biggest risks you see in the industry, but the risks that are most probable to you. Understanding and quantifying those. Understanding what is required to get you to a risk satisfaction that you have agreed on as a business. That actually this is kind of the amount of risk we're willing to investigate, when we're willing to remediate, and this is relevant to this amount of cost, or actually you say this is the amount we're willing to spend, and that will have to navigate how much risk we're going to mitigate, and part of the Softcat service will be help you understand how much of that is achievable and whether that needs tweaking left or right. And then lastly, it's going to be making sure that you are where you think you are, when you say, actually, yes, we feel like we've implemented the right policy, we've implemented the right technology, and we feel like from where we were to where we are now, we've mitigated that risk. And so part of that testing would be within that as well. So that, for me, covers off what I was going to say on the technology around GDPR front. So I think now we're going to refer to the Q&A. I can see there's been a couple of questions that Marc has already answered around a health question around physio and massage services. Marc, do you have anything more you want to say on that one?
No, so I'm just going to look at looking at the Q&A. So there's a couple that have come in from one of our attendees, James, around the sort of dealing with people who've dealing with health data. Now, as I mentioned with regard to as part of my element of the presentation, it would be determined if you're dealing with a large number of special category data. But the larger is a very ambiguous term. Now, one of the things so if you've got more than 500 customers, but you're dealing with more than 500 health records, if there was a breach and it affected all of the data that you hold, would 500 health records be considered large? I would take a risk-averse posture, and I would say so. So based on that, then I would look to appoint a data protection officer. 100, probably not. 250, again, for me that's getting borderline. But 500 when dealing with special category information, then I would say so. On the flip side, if you're not dealing with special category data and you've got 10,000 customers or 5,000 customers, let's say, and you've just got names, companies, physical addresses, and emails, then you probably wouldn't be required to appoint a data protection officer, but you might want to nominate somebody as a data protection manager, for example, but not formally appoint them as far as the Information Commission is concerned. And then there's another question that's come in from James, who has a number of customers who use cloud providers to store data. So they've been trying to determine if Google Drive, Backup and Sync, Dropbox, Microsoft OneDrive are GDPR compliant. With regard to Dropbox, ticking that one off, first of all, Dropbox is primarily hosted and servers within the United States. So outside of the European Economic Area, and is not one of the on the sort of the approved list of countries. So Dropbox probably is not GDPR compliant. What may be required if your customers or yourselves are using Dropbox at the moment would be to identify whether they have signed up with Privacy Shield and or ask them for their GDPR compliance statement. As far as Google and Microsoft are concerned, they've been doing a huge amount of work themselves around GDPR. Microsoft OneDrive, having been on the Microsoft portal fairly recently, I would be fairly confident saying that they are GDPR compliant. And again, I would say the same with regard to, I would imagine so as far as Google is concerned. But again, as part of when you're invoking these services, or certainly with regard to cloud-based solutions, is ensuring that you do pay probably a bit more attention to the T's and C's, because I certainly tend to sort of scroll to the bottom and click I agree, but what we're required to do now is actually pay a little bit more attention to them, which is why they need to be presented in a clear and transparent fashion. To make so that we can view their GDPR compliance statement. Are they providing us with all of the information as part of their privacy notice?
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And I think just to touch on that one as well, I think the cloud services themselves and their security is an apt question to be asking, but I think equally internally we need to be saying how are we controlling and maintaining visibility of what data are we holding in those cloud services. So for some businesses, for example, they may say we use tools like Google Drive or like Dropbox, but this is only to share, for example, large media files, which is an external company video, and it's not for anything internal confidential to be on. There is technology to assist with that, so cloud access security brokering is essentially a tool similar to that of DLP, but it is much more intelligent within those particular cloud services. It allows us to understand the difference between enterprise and user accounts, but also it allows us to set policy against how these cloud services are being engaged with. There is this phenomenon known as shadow IT, which is essentially the business using cloud applications that IT and IT security are unaware of, and cloud application security brokering allows us to give a sanctioned cloud application that we have relevant controls in place for, to ensure that we are utilizing these tools as little as possible from a risk perspective, but still enabling the collaboration that these tools bring along with kind of their availability. So for businesses that have to use cloud, I think cloud application security brokering is a brilliant tool. I think one of the easiest questions to answer is if you can, as a business, not necessarily use one of these from a security perspective. You think actually we use it very rarely. You can look at potential other ways of using that which are potentially less risky. However, there is quite a lot of technology in place to help mitigate that risk. So that would be kind of from a technology perspective what I'd recommend from that. But again, that would need to be assessed against your risk appetite as a business to understand if that is a high risk area for you or not, and the relevant spending that would be appropriate to address that risk with. Haven't got any more questions on the Q&A. Actually, I do have one. Sorry. What's the difference between a breach simulation and a manual penetration test? Really good question. So a breach simulation is much more in-depth than a particular penetration test can be. So breach simulation will assess the whole of the infrastructure and will basically imitate a piece of malware and say, what is this malware trying to do? It will try and propagate, it will try and get across the business. Depending on the particular type of penetration test, whether it's internal, whether it's external, these can be as simple as looking for a vulnerability and saying, these are the vulnerabilities, this is how I would have got across. A breach simulation can utilize potentially multiple vectors at a time. So penetration testing equally is important for people who have compliant frameworks that require they are penetration tested formally once a year. I think 27001 for certain businesses is one that ensures that. But a breach simulation can be looking more about the internal policy and the system configurations. They are somewhat similar in the sense that they're addressing a similar goal, which is to assess the configuration and security construct of that particular piece of technology or that network or that security fabric. But penetration testing can be a lot more specific or a lot broader, and can kind of look at a different depth than that of breach simulation. So unless there are any more questions, which I haven't got in the Q&A box, I think we'll leave that one over to there. I think I'll hand back to the Softcat marketing team.